Hi, welcome. I'm Tristan Wallace, celebrating the 10th year anniversary of the cPanel. For the conference here today, I'm going to cover EXIM optimization. And for the beginning, I want to go through a topic breakdown so that you know what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to introduce what optimization is and what EXIM is, cover monitoring for EXIM, cover the tools that you can use to discover some services for it, cover the EXIM message handling, some example types of options that can be set, some setting locations where within WHM you can set some of these options. I also am going to have a test case where I cover different types of basically message handling and the results for load and memory and stuff like that. I'm not going to be covering limits, which I'll discuss what I mean by limits at the end, and then final thoughts on what we've discussed for this presentation. So, introduction for optimization, just to clarify what we're going to be covering. It's improving how a service or component runs after regular and irregular server conditions. So like high load, latency, high memory. So optimizing how the service runs or component runs regularly and to keep the server stable as well. And it differs from security. Security changes might actually cause a delay in a service, and optimization doesn't take security concerns into account. That would be a topic for a different day. Now, for EXIM itself, it's a mail transfer agent. It is the most commonly used mail transfer agent online. EXIM and SendMail binary are controlled via EXIM on cPanel servers, so that's why I'm covering EXIM. There are examples of other message transfer agents on Linux-based platforms such as Postfix, Qmail, and SendMail, but again, we're only going to be covering EXIM, and it even controls SendMail in this respect. Now, for monitoring is one of the most important things that you need to be familiar with doing for any service that you're trying to see to make sure that it's performing optimally. And in order to monitor, you need to know where the logs are located. The logs for EXIM are var log EXIM main log. That's the log that has all of the transactions that EXIM handles for message handling. There's also a panic log and a reject log, which are var log EXIM _ panic log and EXIM _ reject log. And that's if the service isn't working. For the queue is handled in WHM's email mail queue manager, or you can look at it via the command line via EXIM-BP, or if you want to see the number of messages, it's EXIM space -BPC, and that's an SSH command line. I'm not going to cover details on those. There are online guides that you can look at. There's also a component called EXIMON that is not installed or by default with cPanel-based servers because it requires X Windows. I did put a guide online on the cPanel forums and created a tiny URL for that. So it's at tinyurl.com/cpanel-eximon, EXIMON. And feel free to post any questions you have on that on the forum post. So next we're going to cover some tools that EXIM has to see message deliveries so you have an idea what's happening on the server. So the log files are a place to start for monitoring it. But for some actual tools, there's one called EXIM Stats. This is EXIM's command line utility, and I have Brad the Mad has a discussion within his EXIM guide on using EXIM Stats, EXIM's command line utility, and I did a tiny URL for that as well. And it's tinyurl.com/btm-eximstats. Now, cPanel also has a utility that we call EXIM Stats, and that's handled in WHM's email area. And it does these areas, which are mail delivery reports, view mail statistics summary, view relayers, and view sent summary. And actually within cPanel itself, the track delivery in Paper Lantern also uses EXIM Stats to pull data for deliveries. And then CSF, which is a third-party product from Config Server, Way to the Web. They have LFD alerts that can tell you for emails going over the limit as a tool, and that would be their RT local relay alert =1 in the Etsy csf.config file. But that isn't our tool. That's another third-party product. So for XM message handling, I wanted to break it down I actually just covered incoming emails because XM is such a broad topic. It's difficult to handle both incoming and outgoing messages. And the biggest problem could be incoming messages, because typically incoming are the ones where you're being attacked, rather than you might have someone sending too many emails going outbound where it's your server that might be the issue. Instead, it's more important to handle optimizing it when emails are coming inbound, since you might be attacked by someone trying to do a denial of service or something in that matter. And there are really only 3 types of conditions for any email, whether it's incoming or outgoing, and that's accept, where the server accepts the message and then either delivers it normally or filters it in some method. Defer, where the message is accepted and it's put in the queue, but it isn't delivered. So it remains in the queue until some event happens. And then last would be reject, where it's the server gets it and does not accept it, and it doesn't defer it, it just bounces it back or fails it for a retry. Now I have a chart that actually covers these different types of conditions for incoming messages, and various options that within cPanel that you could use in order to have the server handle the message that way. So for the accept conditions, there's normal delivery, filtering, or delete. And while it might sound strange that delete is an accept condition, it actually is, because the server's accepted the message at that point in time, and the filter, it's basically a type of filter where it's discarding it after it's accepted the message. So it's actually accepted it even though it's deleting it. For normal delivery, that would be just the default setting. You haven't added filters, you haven't done anything else on the server. The default setting allows normal delivery if it's an existing account, and even if it's a non-existing account, but it's a domain that's on the machine. Filters, they're available in cPanel for account and user. The system filter, there's a global system filter file in WHM's XM configuration manager in the basic tab. Spam assassin could be enabled for spam box, and that would filter an email. Delete conditions are things like black holing it, where it's going to dev null. Spam assassin filter could also discard the message again where it's going to dev null. For defer conditions, those are conditions where the message is queued. And things like box trapper, even though it sends back an email to the recipient that they need to confirm that they're legitimate, box trapper does queue the email. So it's actually in a queue waiting until something happens, and it might never deliver or whatever might happen. There are load queues where you have deliver queue, load max, and queue only load, where once the load reaches a certain point, and I'll discuss those 2 options here shortly, it will basically queue the messages. It will not deliver them once it meets those conditions for load on the server. And then frozen messages also would queue because they either can't deliver for some reason, like maybe the email account doesn't exist, and they can't bounce back for some reason. So basically, frozen emails are typically, there's some type of error that prevents the message from going either to deliver or bounce back to the recipient, or fail for any reason. Now, the last type we have are rejections, where there's bounces and retries. And bounces are things like the message fails, so it bounces back, and that's like no such user when you've set the default email address to fail if that email account doesn't exist. If the account's over quota, there's a default option that it would bounce back, and that's before SMTP time, so that actually it could cause backscatter in some instances. And spam assassin failures can again fail if the user doesn't exist or for any other reason that you chose for that message to fail. Could be over the spam score, so it fails and goes back to the user. And then there are fails that retry, where you have gray listing, where it's the first time that user has tried to email the server. They're not on a trusted list for that email account. So if basically rejects the first time, it bounces back, and then it retries again in 15 minutes typically, or whatever the queue run happens to be. On 1150 machines and prior, the queue run is actually at 60 minutes. And for 1152, which will be out in current here shortly, that changes it to 15 minutes to correspond with the gray listing that we implemented in 1150. And then the last setting is one that we don't set at all, but that I'm definitely going to cover later in the presentation because it's a very important option called SMTP load reserve. And this option actually will fail the message, it will reject the message, bounce it back to the user when the load hits that SMTP load reserve level. So when the load averages that level, it will fail it back. It gives a message saying that the server's over a set load. And basically the client can retry, their email server will retry at whatever intervals. And if the load average at that point is below the level of the SMTP load reserve, instead of queuing, then the message will either be accepted or permanently rejected, depending on what would have happened with the message normally. So basically it can prevent the server from hitting a load that's too high because messages, rather than being queued, start being rejected for later retry. So there's a lot of different options, but basically they all break down into accept, defer, and reject options. So some example types I mentioned: accounts over quota. We also have box trapper. Box trapper is the one that will queue the message until someone confirms that they're a legitimate sender. And after that point, they're whitelisted. The default email address, which has normal delivery, fail, or black hole. Normal delivery, it delivers whether the recipient exists or not. Fail is bounce back, which is a reject. And black hole is an accept condition where it does accept the message and then it just discards it. Gray listing, you never emailed the server before. It fails the first time. Retries again in 15 minutes, depending on the email client. The second time it should be accepted. So it's a reject for the first time. And then spam assassin falls under several different, it depends on whether you're blacklisting it, putting in the spam box, or having a failure. So there's various examples for spam assassin on what you could have it do. Now, I did want to cover some settings within WHM because all these things can be set in WHM. And WHM's tweak setting, it's server configuration, tweak settings, mail tab. There's several settings there. That's where the default address is set. The email delivery retry time, which is when the queue runs, which I said was at 60 minutes prior to 11:52, at 15 minutes, 11:52 onward. This is where you can change that. If you don't want it to be at 15 minutes and want to set it back to the 60 minutes on new servers, old servers will maintain the setting of 60 minutes, but new servers that are set up will be 15 minutes for the queue run. Box Trapper is in tweak settings. It's already enabled to on, but if you don't want Box Trapper, you could set it to off. Spam Assassin is automatically enabled to on. Apache Spam Assassin Spam Box Delivery. So the spam box that where it will go into a spam box if it's marked as spam, rather than being rejected or just going into the account, is off by default. So if you actually want to turn on the spam box so that users can configure it, you would have to turn it on in tweak settings in WHM. Next, there are more options for setting XM in XM Configuration Manager. It's Basic tab. And in the Basic tab, there are things like Apache Spam Assassin's Reject Spam Score Threshold. Setting it at 5 would be the suggestion. It has no reject rule by spam score initially, but at 5 would be a good spam score for it to reach in order to be a threshold. Reject remote mail sent to the server's hostname is off. Typically, mail doesn't need to be sent remotely to the server's hostname. That's usually going to be spam emails. So you might want to turn that on. It's off by default. Spam Assassin Rate Limit Spam Score Threshold has no rate limiting by spam score set originally. Again, you might want to set a score like 5. Well, actually below 5, since 5 we were going to reject it if you do enable that. The system filter file that I mentioned earlier, because cPanel has account level and user level filters, but there's a global filter for like dangerous attachments and things like that. But any other type of filter that you want to have globally on the entire server is a system filter file within the XM Configuration Manager's Basic tab. So this is where you do it. If you want to do your own settings, you'd copy the one at Etsy cPanel XM System Filter, and create a new copy and then add whatever settings you want. Apache Spam Assassin Global Subject Rewrite. It's another Spam Assassin setting that's in this area. It's already set to on. Apache Spam Assassin Bounce Spam Score Threshold. No bouncing by spam score is set. You would probably want to set it to 5. And then the Spam Assassin X Spam subject header prefix already is set to asterisk 3 asterisk spam, uppercase spam 3 asterisk. So any message that you have going to normal delivery because the user decided they didn't want to discard it will be marked with spam in the subject because of this setting, and that's again the default. Bounce emails for users over quota, not a Spam Assassin setting. Also in the basic tab, it's on by default, and even though that can cause backscatter because it's rejecting before SMTP time, which it has to, because you have to actually accept the message to know the size in order for it to reject after SMTP time. And because of that, backscatter concerns occur, but because you're rejecting it before, it also is rejecting it without taking the hit on accepting the message and processing it. A good setting to have, also in this area, Apache Spam Assassin Force Global On. It's off by default. If you actually switch it to on, then email accounts, all of them will have Spam Assassin enabled within the user's cPanel. And even though Spam Assassin is set on globally, it's not set on within the user's accounts to allow them to decide if they want it to be on or off. This setting forces it to on for all the users. And I would actually recommend changing it to on because once I go through the testing, you'll see why I'm making that recommendation. And there are some outgoing Spam Assassin options. They are off and disabled. I'm not going to cover those because I mainly looked into incoming messages and I didn't test outgoing emails for Spam Assassin. But if outgoing also seems to throttle emails like incoming does, it might be beneficial to enable those as well beyond security reasons. It might actually help optimize XM. The next tab is XM Configuration Manager's Advanced tab. And there's 3 options I'm going to cover in that. 2 of them we already set, and 1 of them I'm going to recommend that be set. The first one is Deliver Queue Load Max. And this means the queue run is abandoned. So the queue run is every 60 minutes on 11:50 and earlier. It's every 15 minutes on 11:52 and later. And if the load average is greater than this option, and the average is not when you run uptime or top or whatever, and you see the load, the initial one listed is not the average. That's the current load. The average is the next one, which is like the 5-minute load average. So what XM is looking at for these options is the average. So the 5-minute average for load. So if the queue run will be abandoned if the load is greater than this, and we set it at 3 per core. So if you have an 8-core system, that means the load actually has to be an average of 24 before the run of the queue will be abandoned. So XM will quit processing the queue for any messages. The next option is queue only load. Now when the load average is higher than this setting, again, the load average being the 5-minute average, incoming messages from all sources are queued. So this is set at 6 per core, and this isn't about the queue run itself. This is about a new process coming in. It's not going to deliver if the queue hits, if the load hits that certain level for the average. It's 6 per core. If you have an 8-core system, that means the load would have to be 48. And these are configurable in the Advanced tab, and those are the settings. Now, test server I'd only had 1 core. So that was 3 for Deliver Queue Load Max, and it was 6 for Queue Only Load. And then the last one I'm going to recommend, that's unset by XM, it's not set by us. It's called SMTP Load Reserve, and it rejects connections at that load average. So that 5-minute load average, let's say you set it at 5. If you set it at 5, rather than those emails being queued, they will actually reject. And that means that they'll bounce back to the user mentioning the load is high, and that their email client or email server can retry at whatever retry intervals they use, the typical retry interval being 15 minutes. So, and then the load might be low, and then their message might be accepted. So I did test some of these options. I had a very low level VPS machine because I wanted to see some, how I could hit it with a test script and keep it online or get the load to be lower. So on the VPS machine, 1 core, just 1 gigabyte of RAM, CentOS 7 with cPanel and WHM 1150. I test conditions with 5,000 emails sent via remote script, so it wasn't just locally. I was sending from another machine to it, incoming to the machine, and I cleared the queue in between each script run so that prior emails from prior tests didn't impact what was happening for that test. And I'm going to go through each of the conditions that I test. I tested accept with black hole, where it's accepting it and then it's just deleting the message. So it has to process the message and then delete it. I tested it with the default address, where it just accepts an email to any address and just delivers it to the account. I test where I filtered it to go to basically another account. So that would be like a forwarder, but I could have filtered it to a box or anything like that. I did it with queue load removed, where I removed the settings for deliver queue load max and queue only load, which XM doesn't set those. We set those at 3 for deliver queue load max per core and 6 queue only load at 6 per core. So I removed the settings to where they were entirely unset and tested to see what happened there. And I tested it with Spam Assassin filtered to discard email. So an email would be tagged as spam and the server would basically black hole it. It would discard it. And then I tested it again where Spam Assassin, it would put it into the spam box, which I call Spam Assassin filter because it's filtering to a box. It's not removing it. So that filter sent it to the spam box. And then I also tested for defer condition box trapper, where you're getting the email and it's going to go back to the user to inform the user that it's in queue, and they have to authenticate that they're a legitimate user before the email goes through. So it's being queued. And then I tested reject conditions where the email bounces back saying that there isn't any user, where it's gray listed, where it's the first time you've sent the server from your address and you're not whitelisted as a trusted provider. So it goes back the first time as a rejection, and then it retries at whatever retry interval. I tested over quota account, where the account's over quota, they get the emails because they're over quota, it rejects, and it's a permanent rejection. So those emails just go back, they aren't accepted. And they might be retried by the provider, but that's not going to do any good because the account's over quota. And then I tested SMTP load reserve at 5. And any time that once the load hit 5, all emails would be rejected, saying the load is over the set limit and allowing the user to retry. And then finally I tested Spam Assassin fail, where it's hitting the spam score threshold and it's going back to the user. It's bouncing back to the user. And the results were, for accept and defer, the results were approximately the same. The load high was in the 45 to 60 range. For a 1-core machine, that's pretty high. The load average during the test, and I didn't time how long the test took because they were typically anywhere from like 3 to 10 minutes at the most. The load average during the time of the test was 11 to 15. The CPU was pretty freaking high. It was 80 to 90, and the memory was 50 to 70 for the averages. Reject, unlike accept and defer, reject shows lower load CPU and memory. The loads highs were far lower, 8 to 25 approximately. The load averages, again, far lower, about half, 3 to 7. The CPU was 50 to 80, so it's still pretty high for that. The memory was 30 to 50, but everything was basically lower for rejects. So rejects were always better than accepting or deferring the message, queuing it. And some interesting notes about this. For accept conditions, when I removed the limits on load to where things didn't queue once they hit a certain load, and I changed it to where it accepted everything. Basically, it's going to accept, if it's going to be accepted by XM, it would be accepted. It caused the server to crash. The load hit 189 and then it crashed. It's pretty impressive. It made it to 189 for the load. For reject, Adding SMTP load reserve prevented high load as it changed the server from accept defer state to reject state once it hit that load average. So the load did actually get up to 25 at some points on reject, even at 5 being the level, but it couldn't crash the server, and the server was never as high as it was with just deliver queue load max and queue only load. And Spam Assassin was very, very surprising. Once I added Spam Assassin to the account itself, because it's enabled by default on the server, but it's not enabled per account. When I enabled it on the account, it reduced the message delivery speed. So emails were taking longer to arrive because they had to be scanned through Spam Assassin, but the load never got high. The average was approximately 3 and the high was approximately 3. It took longer. So it's almost like it's throttling the message because the script I used didn't throttle the messages. They tried to send as quickly to the server from the other server as possible. But Spam Assassin, due to scanning each message, was basically creating some type of throttle that appeared to keep the load low. So enabling Spam Assassin did something that I didn't expect. The load was far lower with Spam Assassin. Today, I did not cover limits. Things like rate limits for incoming emails, sending limits for outgoing emails, and failure limits for outgoing emails. Limits would throttle because you can only have so many connections then. But there were only so many things they could cover, and I didn't feel that the limits were within the scope of what I needed to see for optimization. It might have made it more difficult to determine the best options for this initial discussion on optimization. Some final thoughts that I wanted to provide. Obviously, email is important for most users. Now, the server, though, needs to stay running for all legitimate users. So when taking into account, like, creating a server being a rejection source so that you have a high load and you're rejecting emails. Yes, some people are not going to get their emails delivered in a timely fashion. But in order to, while you're doing that, you might be keeping the server online for all legitimate users, for things like their websites, for their databases, for FTP, for using cPanel. So while it's important to have email available, you don't want to crash the server just to have email available. And you don't want to crash the server simply to allow timely delivery, possibly. So in some instances, using something like SMTP load reserve would be called for. So XM has 3 types of message handling conditions: accept, defer, reject, which I've already covered. And I'm going to have a slide after this one to look at that slide again. And these are the only options from what I tested that have a significant impact on stability for incoming email, which is defer options, queue only load, and deliver queue load max. If those are not set, the server crashes. I mean, that's all there is to it. With all other default settings being the same, if you do not set these, which cPanel already does, and you might want to tweak them based on the number of cores. You might not like the 3 per core. You might not think 48 is a good queue-only load setting because you have 8 cores. You probably don't want the load still to be a load average of 48. So you might want to tweak those, but you definitely want to keep those. And then the only other options that help for XM-based options are gray listing, but you have to recall with gray listing, while it's originally rejecting the email, it will accept the email the second time. So basically, it rejects it the first time. So if you have someone who's trying to spam the server and does retry in 15 minutes, they're going to be added. And then at that point in time, gray listing really wasn't going to help you. If the count's over quota, keeping it that it rejects it rather than accepting it is going to cut down on the load. And then SMTP load reserve, which isn't set, and I highly recommend just to keep the load below a certain level in conjunction with the deliver queue load max and queue only load. And then the one that I really found surprising, Spam Assassin. Enabling it on an account appears to throttle the emails to the point that the load is far, far lower. And it didn't matter what you were doing with XM, whether you were filtering it to a box like Spam Box, whether you were discarding it, or whether whatever you were doing with it. As long as Spam Assassin was scanning it, the load was lower, and the memory and everything. And here's that chart again with the accept, defer, and reject conditions, in case you wanted to see the different types of conditions again, and I put the best options for optimization on the chart with the defer, reject, and spam assassin. And imagine that would be helpful for people who might be looking into explaining why you might be wanting to change some settings one way or another, to possibly the people that are on the server. And again, I'm Tristan Wallace. If you'd like to contact me with any questions on the presentation, my email address is Tristan, Tristan, @cpanel.net. And I have Twitter at Miranda, which is Miraenda. And you're welcome to contact me on either.